Invasive species are currently regarded as one of the 5 major causes of biodiversity loss. The relative importance of invasive species as a threat varies from place to place, but very few ecosystems anywhere on Earth have been spared the effects of invasive species. With that, it is important to understand the biology of invasive species, their ecology and evolution. Understand the invasion process. What makes a species invasive? And what makes a habitat invisible? What are the impacts of this invasive species? And what is being done to manage them? An alien species is a species introduced by humans, either intentionally or accidentally, outside of its natural past or present distribution. However, not all alien species have negative impacts, and it is estimated that between 5 and 20% of all alien species become problematic. It is these species that are termed invasive alien species. An invasive alien species is a species that is established outside of its natural past or present distribution, whose introduction and/or spread threaten biological diversity. Convention on biological diversity. Let's take a quick look at the phenomenon of biological invasions, which is what happens when species are introduced to new environments and multiply and spread rapidly. People have moved organisms around the world for thousands of years. Such movements often leave key natural enemies of organisms behind, helping the introduced species to reproduce more effectively or survive better in their new environment than they would in their native range. This is called enemy release and, for some species, this explains why alien species behave very differently in new regions. The ways that humans use and move the species around within new regions also determines whether, and to what extent, such species are likely to spread. Why do invasive species successfully establish and invade? Several hypotheses about why invaders succeed occurs. This includes, invasive species have traits that favor establishment and spread. Invasive species are released from enemies. Invasive species exploit empty niches. Invasive species are favored by anthropogenic pressure on natives, disturbance. How do invasive species establish? Factors that can affect the successful establishment and spread of invasive species includes propagal pressure, minimum viable population size, lag period and climate and environment. Propagal pressure, this refers to the number and frequency of introductions of an organism or propagals into a new area. Typically, the larger the number of individuals that are introduced, and if the introductions are spread out over a long time interval, together these two things will likely increase the chances of the organism establishing. An introduced species is only going to survive and do well in an area in which the climate is suitable. For example, nice temperatures, adequate water, and if there are sufficient resources available for growth and reproduction. For example, lots of food, no diseases or predators, and lack of competitors all year round. For an individual to be successfully established, it needs to accomplish at least 4 tasks. First, it needs to find an environment with tolerable abiotic conditions. It needs to be able to access resources necessary for maintenance, growth and reproduction. It needs to find a mate. And lastly, it needs to avoid pre-reproductive mortality. The ability of an organism to achieve these tasks is going to be greatly influenced by the traits it possesses. Let's take a look at American mink as an example of a good invader. What makes the American mink highly invasive? The American mink have high reproductive potential. It usually have a litter size between 5 to 6 kits. It is highly territorial. Means, it outcompete its rival species. The American mink is also tolerant to many conditions. It is not sensitive to cold, so it can survive harsh winters in northern Europe better than other species. It is also a generalist predator. As a semi-aquatic animal, it is both aquatic and terrestrial prey, which means it can exploit a wide range of mammals, birds and fish. Lastly, it is associated with human activities. The American mink is introduced in Europe for fur farming. Why are some communities more invisible than others? The invisibility of an environment is influenced by the interaction of biological and physical processes operating at the local scale. Invisibility is the ability, or inability, of an environment to permit establishment. Invisibility describes the susceptibility of an environment to the colonization and establishment of individuals from species not currently part of the resident community. The primary effect of an environment's invisibility on local diversity is as a filter of incoming propagals. Invisibility of an environment varies from species to species, from genotype to genotype, and even from phenotype to phenotype of identical genotypes. The same environment at the same point in time may be quite invisible to one organism type, but quite resistant to colonization and establishment by another type. One of the theories for invisibility is the fluctuating resource theory. Fluctuating resource availability theory of invisibility states that pulses of resources should be expected to increase the invisibility of an environment. Fluctuating availability of resources in space and/or time will lead to a fluctuation in the intensity of competition, which may prevent competitive exclusion from occurring. Resource changes on a global scale may also influence establishment of certain species in particular regions. It is the increase in the availability of the limiting resources that is expected to increase invisibility. Environmental heterogeneity, both in space and time, should increase invisibility. Disturbances often contribute to a temporally and spatially heterogeneous environment. Harsh sites are more internally heterogeneous at small scales than productive sites are. Hence, they have more niches for both natives and exotics, leading to coexistence and a positive relationship between native and exotic diversity. Invisibility would also be expected to peak at intermediate frequencies/intensities of disturbance, as would species diversity intermediate disturbance hypothesis. By increasing spatial heterogeneity through the killing of some residents, disturbances occurring at intermediate levels create patches of available resources, while not imposing excessive obstacles to establishment, thereby leading to increases in both invisibility and species diversity. Environmental favorability hypothesis covers coexistence mechanisms that depend on mean conditions rather than heterogeneity in conditions. Native and exotic diversity are positively correlated at large spatial scales, because sites with favorable conditions for natives also have favorable conditions for exotics. Extreme physical stress of an environment would be expected to reduce invisibility to all species except those possessing adaptations to the physical stressors. If physical stress harms the native species more so than the new arrivals, an increase in physical stress could increase invisibility. Extreme temperatures and precipitation would preclude the colonization and establishment of all species except those able to tolerate these conditions. Another hypothesis is the enemy release hypothesis. Newly introduced species will enjoy superiority over the native species, which must withstand attack by both their specialist and generalist enemies. The ability of new species to colonize and establish in new environments has often been attributed to the absence of natural enemies in the new environment. Spatial and temporal heterogeneity in the physiochemical environment and resources provide a myriad of diverse colonizing opportunities. Facilitation takes place as part of a mutualistic interaction between the incoming non-native species and resident species or other incoming non-native species. Facilitation is a biotic interaction in which at least one of the species involved benefits from the presence of the other and neither is negatively affected. Facilitation includes interactions between co-evolved, mutually obligate organisms as well as facultative interactions between species that are not evolutionarily linked. Species involved in mutualistic relationships in their native environment would have difficulty establishing in a novel environment without their mutualistic partner. Non-native species, like native species, can impact human health, national and local economies, and the ecosystems and ecological communities in which they reside. In fact, most non-native species do not have a large impact in any of these three areas. Some even have desirable effects. However, a small proportion of non-native species are considered harmful or undesirable owing to their impacts. Impacts on human health and safety. An introduced pathogen can infect humans with a new disease. An introduced species may serve as a new and effective vector for the transmission of some already established diseases, increasing their infection rates. In some areas, an introduced species may kill crop plants to such an extent that the resident people experience caloric or other dietary deficits. In some cases, introduced species produce biotoxins, which can harm people, for example by contaminating potable water sources. Economic impacts. Economic costs to society of harmful non-native species involve the costs associated with losses and damages, as well as the costs of efforts to control the species and their impacts. Non-native plant pathogens may have economic effects beyond their impacts on their respective crops. Since plant pathogens are viewed as being a possible terrorist weapon, some countries are investing considerable additional resources in trying to prevent the introductions of particular pathogens. Although one could argue that almost any ecological impact has the potential to affect some ecological service, the impacts of many non-native species are mostly restricted to other species and to the structures and processes of their new ecosystems, with little known impact on ecological services. 5 types of ecological impacts caused by non-native invasive species have been identified. This includes genetic impacts, impacts affecting individual organisms, impacts affecting population dynamics, impacts altering community structure, and impacts affecting ecosystem processes. Thank you.